Explorer Mason Scott devoured by hyena in wild. In the heart of an untamed wilderness, where rugged beauty intertwined with unspoken dangers, a ruthless hyena had long reigned supreme. Its power, built upon a foundation of sheer intimidation and unchecked brutality, cast a shadow over the land. The hyena, convinced of its own invincibility, roamed the terrain with an air of arrogance, its presence a constant reminder of the perils that lurked within the wild's embrace. Amidst this untamed landscape, a beacon of light emerged in the form of Mason Scott, an intrepid explorer whose life was devoted to uncovering the hidden truths that lay buried beneath the wild surface. With an insatiable curiosity and an unwavering commitment to knowledge, Mason ventured into the depths of the wilderness, armed with nothing more than his wits, his courage, and an unquenchable thirst for discovery. As Mason traversed the rugged terrain, his path crossed with that of the hyena, a creature whose reputation preceded it. The explorer, undaunted by the tales of the hyena's savagery, pressed forward, determined to unravel the mysteries that lay ahead. Little did he know that his quest would lead him to a fate far more treacherous than he could have ever imagined. In a moment of unthinkable cruelty, the hyena, driven by its insatiable hunger for dominance, set its sights upon Mason. With a swift and merciless strike, the beast ended the explorer's life, devouring him whole and shattering the illusion of its own invincibility. The act of brutality sent shockwaves through the wilderness, reverberating through the hearts of all who had known and admired Mason Scott. News of Mason Scott's tragic demise spread like wildfire, reaching the ears of those who had once celebrated his daring spirit and relentless pursuit of knowledge. Among them was a close kin, a young protagonist whose heart was forged in the fires of resilience, hope, and an unwavering sense of justice. This emerging hero, forever changed by the loss of their beloved mentor, found themselves consumed by a singular purpose: to honor Mason's memory and dismantle the false power of terror that had long gripped the wild. As the protagonist grappled with the weight of their grief, they found solace in the memories of Mason's teachings. The explorer had always believed in the transformative power of compassion, the strength that could be found in unity, and the potential for even the smallest acts of kindness to ignite a spark of change. Armed with these lessons, the protagonist set forth on a journey to rally the community, determined to confront the hyena and its reign of fear. The protagonist's first steps were met with hesitation and doubt from those who had long been cowed by the hyena's might. Fear had become a constant companion, etched into the very fabric of their lives. Yet, the protagonist's unwavering resolve and the echoes of Mason's wisdom began to stir something within the hearts of the community, a flicker of hope that had long been suppressed. Slowly but surely, the protagonist's message of unity and compassion began to take root. Small acts of kindness, once thought insignificant in the face of such overwhelming darkness, now took on a new meaning. The community, once fractured by fear, began to come together, united by a shared purpose and a belief in the power of their collective strength. As the protagonist's influence grew, whispers of change began to echo through the wilderness. The hyena, long accustomed to unchallenged dominion, took notice of the shifting tides. Its eyes, once filled with the certainty of its own supremacy, now glinted with a hint of unease. The beast, unused to any form of resistance, bristled at the thought of its authority being questioned. In an attempt to reassert its control, the hyena lashed out with renewed ferocity, targeting those who dared to stand against it. The wilderness became a battleground, a stage upon which the struggle between hope and fear played out in a dance of tooth and claw. Yet, even in the face of such brutality, the protagonist and the community refused to succumb to despair. They found strength in each other, in the bonds that had been forged through shared adversity. The elders of the community, once resigned to a life of submission, now stepped forward as mentors, imparting their wisdom and guiding the younger generation in the ways of resilience and perseverance. The protagonist, ever the student, listened intently, absorbing the lessons of the past and weaving them into a tapestry of hope for the future. As the community rallied around the protagonist, small victories began to mount. Acts of defiance, once unthinkable, now became commonplace. Gardens, once left to wither under the hyena's shadow, now blossomed with new life, symbols of the community's determination to reclaim what had been lost. In the heart of the wilderness, a spark of change had been ignited, and its flames grew brighter with each passing day. The hyena, sensing the growing tide of resistance, retreated to the shadows, its confidence shaken by the unity displayed by the community. The beast, accustomed to preying upon the weak and isolated, found itself at a loss when confronted with the strength of a united front. Yet, even in its retreat, the hyena's malice festered, plotting its next move in a desperate bid to reassert its dominance. Meanwhile, the protagonist continued to lead the community, guided by the principles that Mason Scott had instilled within them. They sought out the hidden corners of the wilderness, unearthing the secrets that the explorer had long sought to uncover. With each discovery, the protagonist felt a deepening connection to their fallen mentor, a sense of purpose that transcended mere vengeance. As the community worked tirelessly to rebuild what had been lost, they found solace in the simple joys of togetherness. Communal gatherings, once a rarity in the face of the hyena's oppression, now became a regular occurrence. Laughter, long absent from the wilderness, began to echo through the air once more, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Yet, even amidst the growing sense of hope, the protagonist remained vigilant, knowing that the hyena's threat still loomed large. They understood that the battle was far from over, that true victory would only be achieved when the beast's hold over the wilderness was shattered once and for all. With renewed determination, the protagonists steeled themselves for the challenges that lay ahead, ready to lead the community into a future free from fear. As the hyena plotted its next move, the protagonist came across something that would change everything. Clues that Mason Scott had hidden away long ago about the hyena's origins and history. Poring over Mason's old notes and journals, the protagonist began to piece together a shocking tale. The hyena, it seemed, had not always been the brutish creature that now terrorized the wild. Once, long ago, it had been a respected member of the animal kingdom, a cunning hunter known more for its intelligence than its savagery. But something had changed. Some dark event had twisted the hyena, warping its very nature into something cruel and unrecognizable. As the protagonist dug deeper, a name began to surface in Mason's writing. Scar. Scar had been the hyena's mate, its equal in every way. Together they had ruled their territory with fairness and wisdom. But Scar had fallen ill with a strange disease, and as its health deteriorated, so too did the hyena's heart blacken with grief and rage. When Scar finally succumbed, something inside the hyena had snapped. It blamed the other animals for not doing more to help, not finding a cure. Slowly, the hyena's pain twisted into malice and cruelty, until it became the tyrant it was today, lashing out at a world it felt had betrayed it. Reading this tragic history, the protagonist felt the first stirrings of something beyond anger and fear. It was pity, for it understood now that the hyena was not some unknowable evil, but rather a broken creature, damaged by loss. For the first time, the protagonist began to wonder, was there some way to reach the hyena? To make it see how far it had strayed from what it once was? It was a dangerous thought. The protagonist knew that the hyena's long path into darkness may well have placed it beyond redemption, that it may be safer to go on as it had planned, uniting the community to destroy their tormentor once and for all. But Mason's writings had awoken something in them, a need to understand, to find light where before they could only see darkness. Armed with this new knowledge, the protagonist called a meeting of the community's elders and leaders. They shared what they had learned about the hyena's past, watching the expressions of their neighbors change from anger and disgust to shock and even a grudging empathy. "I'm not saying we should forgive the beast for what it's done," the protagonist said. "Mason's blood is still on its teeth. But perhaps, if we can find a way to remind the hyena of the creature it once was, the mate it once loved, perhaps we won't need to destroy it utterly to free ourselves." The gathering erupted into heated debate. Many felt that the hyena was too far gone, that any attempt to reason with it would only leave them vulnerable to its viciousness. "You cannot negotiate with a rabid animal," one elder said grimly. Only put it down before it spreads its disease. But others began to see the wisdom in the protagonist's words. Violence met with violence breeds only more violence, a wise old woman said. And if we reduce ourselves to the hyena's level, do we not risk losing the very thing that separates us from beasts? Our compassion, our ability to see light in the darkest of places. In the end, they struck an accord. The community would continue to build its strength and unity. They would not let down their guard or the hyena forget their growing power. But they would also seek some way to communicate with their tormentor. Some way to reach the creature the hyena had once been, before grief and rage had stripped it of its true nature. It was a slim hope, but it was hope nonetheless. Little did they know that the hyena had spies among them, and that even now word was reaching the beast of their foolish attempts at parley. In its lair, the hyena paced and snarled, wounds old and new throbbing with each step. So, it growled, "They think they can tame me with pretty words and limp peace offerings? They think they can make me weak as Scar was weak? I will show them the price of their arrogance." Over the next weeks, the community worked to put their plan into action. Hunting parties and patrols were organized to keep the hyena at bay and protect their territory. At the same time, the protagonist and a small group of volunteers began venturing out into the wilderness, leaving offerings of food and medicine at the edges of the hyena's domain. At first, the gifts were met with only snarls and scraping claws. The hyena, suspecting some trick, would wait until the protagonist was long gone before creeping out to snatch the offering, only to discard it immediately, as though it feared poisoning. But slowly, as the volunteers continued their missions undeterred, something began to change. One day, returning to a spot where they had left a particularly tempting morsel the night before, the protagonist found a small, polished stone sitting in its place. Another time, a perfect bird's feather, iridescent black. Tokens, the protagonist realized with a thrill of hope, small signs that some part of their message was being heard. Meanwhile, back in the community, spirits were lifted by shared purpose and the slow return of plenty. Crops flourished in well-tended fields. Laughter rang out behind new pickets and ditches that kept the settlements safe. And always at the center was the protagonist, leading by example, inspiring with words and deeds alike. But the hyena would not let this challenge to its supremacy go unanswered. In the dead of night, it began to stage raids against hunting parties and outlying farmers. Cruel traps appeared in the brush, maiming the unwary. Fear again stalked the land. Yet even in the face of these trials, the community refused to succumb to despair. For every hurt, they tended their wounds and comforted their afflicted. For every loss, they redoubled their resolve. They would not be cowed back into submission. And though the protagonist grieved each new tragedy, they would not let the hyena poison the seeds of hope they had planted. One crisp morning, the protagonist set out with a fresh batch of offerings, only to find their path blocked by a familiar, hulking shape. The hyena stepped forth from the brush, hackles raised, fangs bared. It had decided to deal with this upstart directly. So, it growled, "You are the one who would steal my kingdom with baubles and sweet poisons." The protagonist stood their ground, meeting the hyena's burning gaze without flinching. "I am only trying to remind you of the creature you once were, of the love you have lost and may yet find again, if you can release your hate." For a single heartbeat, the hyena's eyes seemed to flicker with something like uncertainty, a shadow of long-buried grief. Then it lunged, massive jaws snapping shut just short of the protagonist's throat. "I am what your world has made me, man-thing," it snarled, "and I will rule my kingdom as I see fit, without your mewling attempts to make me weak." With that, it whirled and vanished back into the brush, leaving the protagonist shaken but unharmed. The message was clear. The hyena would not relinquish its reign of terror without a fight. The path forward would be neither safe nor easy, but it was the only path that offered any hope of lasting peace. Squaring their shoulders, the protagonist continued on their mission, leaving their offering in the usual spot. They could only pray it would not be the last. The hyena's direct confrontation left the protagonist shaken, but also more determined than ever to see their mission through. They understood now, more viscerally than ever, the depths of pain and anger that drove the beast. But they had also glimpsed, if only for an instant, the flicker of something else behind those furious eyes, a hint of the creature the hyena had once been. Returning to the community, the protagonist called another gathering to share what had occurred. Some urged immediate retaliation for the hyena's aggression. Others advocated abandoning the attempt at outreach entirely in the face of such clear hostility. But the protagonist urged patience and persistence. The hyena's hatred is a poison that has festered for years, perhaps decades, they argued. We cannot expect it to heal overnight or without struggle. But if we answer viciousness with viciousness, we will only feed that poison until it consumes us all. In the end, a compromise was struck. The community's defenses would be redoubled, with more guards and stronger fortifications to protect against the hyena's anticipated backlash. But the mission of outreach would also continue, with the protagonist leading more volunteers to leave offerings and tokens of goodwill. As expected, the hyena's attacks escalated in the wake of the confrontation. Hunters were ambushed in the brush. Livestock was slaughtered and crops trampled. A sense of siege descending, fraying the nerves of even the most steadfast. But for every blow, the community responded with resilience and compassion. Neighbors took in those displaced by lost livestock and harvest. The injured were tended with herb and salve. And through it all, the protagonist and their band of volunteers continued their missions, leaving ever more extravagant gifts, tokens of friendship and memory. Unbeknownst to the community, this steady campaign of kindness in the face of terror was working a subtle change in their tormentor. With each offering, each reminder of the creature it had once been, the hyena felt the armor of its rage crack a little more. Memories long buried began to surface. Of a mate loved and lost, of hunts shared in companionable silence, of a time before pain became the North Star of its existence. And with each memory, a dull ache bloomed in the hyena's chest, an unfamiliar sensation which it slowly recognized as the first pangs of regret. Still, it could not simply turn aside from the path it had walked for so long. The drumbeat of violence and domination sang in its very bones now. To the hyena, no other life was conceivable, or so it tried to tell itself, even as the protagonist's words echoed in its skull. One evening, as the sun dipped below the canopy, the hyena found itself drawn to the edge of the human settlement, telling itself it was only reconnaissance for its next raid. But when it spotted the protagonist, something shifted in its intent. Slinking through the brush, it drew as close as it dared, until it could hear the earnest timbre of the human's voice as they rallied their people. "I know you are tired," the protagonist was saying. "I know you are afraid. In your place, I would be too. But we must hold to hope and to each other. For when we succumb to division and despair, well, we have all seen where that road leads." The protagonist's eyes blazed in the dying light, not with fury but conviction. But there is another way, a harder road that offers more than mere survival. A path that leads to peace and life renewed. Mason Scott died trying to show us that path, to light it through the wilderness of our fear and pain. Now, surrounded by the gifts of your resilience and compassion, I see that light shining brighter. As the hyena slunk back into the shadows, the protagonist's words echoed in its mind, warring with the hatred and pain that had driven it for so long. Sleep eluded the beast that night, as it paced its lair, wrestling with unfamiliar doubts and long-buried grief. In the settlement, a fragile hope was taking root. The community had not only weathered the worst of the hyena's onslaught, but emerged stronger for it. Bonds of trust and mutual aid, forged in adversity, now pulsed with vibrant life. The once scattered people were becoming something more, united by purpose and hard-won wisdom. The protagonists saw this change, and it filled their heart with a fierce pride. But they knew their work was not yet done. The hyena's attacks had slowed, but not ceased. And there was still the question of the beast itself, tormented creature that it was. Could it truly be brought back from the abyss of its own making? Determined to find out, the protagonists redoubled their efforts. They spent long hours in the wild, leaving ever more personal tokens. Not just food and trinkets now, but objects imbued with meaning. A smooth river stone that recalled Scar's eyes, a clump of sweet grass like that which once lined their den. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the hyena began to respond in kind. A perfectly formed claw, rare sign of an unscarred paw. A tooth, long and curved, from prey that tasted of brighter days. With each exchange, the protagonist felt the chasm between human and beast narrow, if only by a fraction. One full moon, the protagonist ventured out alone, following a hunch to a place by a still pool where they knew the hyena sometimes came to drink. There they waited, heart pounding but spirit calm, as the night deepened around them. It was near dawn when the brush finally parted, and the hyena stepped into the moonlight. For a long moment, human and beast regarded each other across the gap of centuries as much as meters. Then slowly, deliberately, the hyena lowered itself to the ground, huge head coming to rest on massive paws. "Why?" it asked, voice ragged with exhaustion and some unnameable emotion. "Why do you not hate, as I have hated?" The protagonist considered the question, the weight of all that lay behind and ahead. "Because I choose not to," they said at last. "Because hatred is a fire that burns the hand which holds it. Because I believe there is more to you, and to us all, than the worst of what we've done." A heavy silence descended. Then the hyena spoke again, and this time there was no mistaking the pain that threaded its growl. "I am lost," it said. "I am lost, and I do not know the way back." Hearing those words, the protagonist felt a great welling of compassion. They understood then the enormity of what they were asking, for a creature to turn its back on all it knew, all it had become, in the name of a half-remembered better self. It was a thing no soul could do alone. Slowly, carefully, the protagonist stood. Then, step by step, they began to close the distance between them, hand outstretched in offering. "Then let me show you," they said softly. "Let me walk with you until you find the path again." For a heartbeat, the hyena remained motionless. Then, with a shuddering breath, it pushed itself to its feet. And as the first light of dawn spilled across the pool, human and beast took the first steps of a new journey, side by side, into an uncertain future bright with possibility. News of the protagonist's extraordinary encounter with the hyena spread quickly through the community. Some hailed it as a miracle, proof of the power of persistence and compassion. Others whispered of witchcraft and dangerous naivete, certain that the beast's change of heart could only be a ploy to lure them into complacency. But the protagonist remained steadfast in their belief. In the days that followed, they spent long hours with the hyena, sometimes talking, sometimes simply sitting in silent communion. Slowly, halting at first but then with growing urgency, the beast began to share its story, the joys and trials of its life with Scar, the creeping darkness that took hold after her loss. As understanding grew, so too did a tentative trust. The hyena made no more raids on the settlement. And when a party of hunters stumbled into one of its old traps, it was the beast itself who led the rescue, guiding the humans to the ensnared through back trails only it knew. Still, tension simmered. Many could not forget the years of terror, the lives lost and scars borne. They looked askance at the protagonist's efforts, muttering of foolishness and betrayal behind closed doors. Matters came to a head when a group of hot-headed youths, against the express wishes of the elders, staged their own attack on the hyena's lair, meaning to catch the beast unawares and finish it off once and for all. But the hyena was no easy prey. Enraged more than afraid, it drove off the interlopers with savage ferocity, leaving more than one bloodied and mauled. When the battered band limped back to the settlement, outrage ignited like wildfire. "You see!" cried the loudest of the hyena's detractors. "The beast cannot change its nature. It will always turn on us the moment we let down our guard. And what choice did we give it?" the protagonist shouted back. "When it has done nothing but hold to the truce these past days. When we repaid its restraint with unprovoked violence." The argument raged long into the night, the community tearing at itself as much as at the question of the hyena. Finally, as tempers frayed and shouts gave way to stony silence, the elders intervened. "Enough," spoke the oldest of them. voice thin with age but hard as iron. We have seen where division and suspicion lead us, down all the old, bloody paths that end only in sorrow. Her rheumy eyes found the protagonist in the crowd. If there is even a chance that a new way may be found, are we not bound by conscience to seek it? A reluctant murmuring of assent rippled through the assembly. It was decided the peace would hold, but a watch would be kept. The hyena would be given a chance, but not trust. Not yet. As the gathering dispersed, the weight of leadership heavy on their shoulders, the protagonists slipped away into the night. They had a beast to check on, a fragile understanding to shore up. The road ahead would be rockier than ever, but they had to believe it still led, however winding, to a better place. In the shadows of the wild, amber eyes watched the humans approach wary, but unafraid. There was still much to be decided, much to heal. But in that moment, in the space between separate paths joined for a fragile instant, there was something almost like hope, waiting in the stillness. In the days that followed, an uneasy peace settled over the land. The hyena withdrew to the edges of its old territory, careful to avoid any confrontation with the human settlements. The protagonist, for their part, continued their missions of outreach, but now with a select group of volunteers, each sworn to uphold the fragile truce. Progress was slow, hampered by generations of mistrust and fear on both sides. Many in the community still viewed the protagonist's efforts with suspicion, certain that disaster was brewing just out of sight. And the hyena, for all its tentative steps towards a new path, was still a creature of deep-rooted instincts, quick to anger and slow to trust. But despite the setbacks and uncertainties, a change was taking root. With each passing day, the volunteers reported more signs of the hyena's shift game, left purposefully unheralded. Warning snarls replaced by wary curiosity. And in the settlement, too, hearts were softening. Some even began to speak of the beast with a kind of grudging respect, admiring its resilience and fierce intelligence. The protagonist nurtured these seeds of understanding with a patient hand. They organized gatherings where the volunteers shared their experiences, painting a picture of a creature not so different from themselves, driven by pain and fear, yes, but also by a bone-deep longing for connection and meaning. Slowly, a new narrative began to take shape, one that cast the hyena not as an implacable foe, but as a potential ally, a fellow traveler on the hard road to healing. But not all were swayed by this vision. There were still those who clung to the old hatreds, seeing in the hyena's overtures only a more insidious threat. They whispered of the protagonist's folly, of the doom that surely awaited them all if they let down their guard. Matters came to a head when a group of these hardliners, frustrated by what they saw as the community's complacency, staged a covert raid on the hyena's lair. Their aim was to provoke a confrontation, to shatter the truce and prove once and for all the folly of the protagonist's path. But the hyena, whether through a newfound restraint or simple chance, was not in its den when the raiders struck. Instead, they found only the pathetic remains of its old life, gnawed bones and matted furs, a reeking testament to the depths of its despair. Something in that sight, in the inescapable evidence of a pain so like their own, gave the hardliners pause. They returned to the settlement not in triumph, but in troubled silence, the seeds of doubt taking root in even the most stubborn of hearts. When word of the incursion reached the protagonist, they knew a decisive moment had come. The truce had held, but only just. If they were to have any hope of forging a lasting peace, they would need to act, and act now. Gathering the community once again, the protagonist spoke not of the hyena's crimes, but of their shared hopes. "We have all suffered," they said, voice ringing with conviction. "We have all known loss and fear and the temptation to lash out in anger. But if we meet violence with violence, rage with rage, we doom ourselves to repeat the same cruel story over and over until there is nothing left in the world but blood and sorrow." They spoke of Mason, of the dream of understanding and unity he had died for. They spoke of the hyena, of the glimmers of change they had seen, the possibility of a creature freed from the prison of its pain. And as they spoke, the protagonist felt the mood of the crowd begin to shift. Heads nodded, eyes brightened. For the first time, they dared to believe that a different ending might be possible. Not an easy salvation, but a hard-won reconciliation, a healing of wounds old and new. As the meeting broke up, the protagonist knew the path ahead would be harder than ever, but they also knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that it was the only path worth walking. The time had come to seek out the hyena, to take the final steps on the journey they had begun so long ago. The very future hung in the balance. And though the protagonist's heart quickened at the thought of what lay ahead, it quickened not with fear, but with fragile, flickering hope. The protagonist set out at dawn, a small pack of provisions slung over their shoulder and a newfound resolve in their heart. They knew the confrontation to come would test them as never before, but they also knew with a quiet certainty that they could not turn back now. Too much hung in the balance, too many fragile threads of possibility. As they walked, the protagonist's mind churned with all they had learned, all they had seen in the long months since Mason's death. The community's slow, painful journey towards unity, the hyena's halting steps towards redemption, the moments of connection and understanding, fragile as gossamer but no less real for it. For the protagonist, it was a daily reminder of the mission that had called them, the purpose they had found in the wake of tragedy. Mason's dream, once a fragile flicker, had become a blaze, a guiding light for a world that had known too much darkness. And so, when the time came to mark the anniversary of the explorer's passing, it was not with mourning, but with celebration. The community gathered, hyena and human side by side, to honor the man who had shown them the way. They spoke of courage, of the strength it took to meet fear with compassion. They spoke of unity, of the bonds that could grow between even the most unlikely of allies. And they spoke of hope, of the enduring belief that a better world was possible, if only they had the courage to build it. As the celebration reached its peak, the protagonists found themselves standing once again before the assembled throng. But this time, their words were not a call to arms, but a benediction. "We stand today as a testament to the power of understanding," they said, voice ringing with quiet joy. "A living proof that hatred need not be the final word, that even the deepest of wounds can heal." They turned then to the hyena, eyes shining with affection and respect. "And we stand as witnesses to the truth that redemption is never beyond reach, that even the most broken among us can find the strength to change." The beast inclined its head, a gesture of gratitude and humility, and in that moment, protagonist and predator, human and hyena, stood as one, bound by a love that had triumphed over fear, a hope that had outlasted hate. Their story, they knew, would be told for generations. A legend of the wild, a fable of the human heart. And though the road ahead would be long and the challenges many, they would face them as they had learned to face all things, together, united by an unshakable faith in the power of compassion. For in the end, that was the lesson the hyena had taught them, the gift Mason had given with his final breath. That even in the darkest of times, in the most broken of worlds, there was always a choice, a chance to be more than the sum of their scars, to write a new story in the face of fear. And as the sun set on that glorious day, bathing the celebration in a golden glow, the protagonist knew that choice would guide them, now and always. A north star in a world that had once seemed lost to darkness. A light to lead them home,